Going to do some slightly lighter setup type repairs today. Keep it nice and breezy. First up, we've got a Guild 12 string. It's been a few months since I last did a 12. It takes that long to recover, you know. Anyway, this is a 2512E, or F2512E. I may have filmed one of these in the past. I can't remember. This is one of the models where they have a gently arched, laminated back with no braces on the inside. Always gives me a bit of a surprise to see a flat top this big, it's a jumbo, with no back braces. I'm assuming the lamination, which is, it's made of a high quality birch veneer, like, you know, a Nordic type birch. I guess it's pretty thick to stand up to the tension. Nevertheless, these things do tend to distort in classic 12-string fashion. The top on this is bellied a little bit, and the back of the bridge is lifting. With the feeler gauge here, I can see there's, you know, an area all along the back, sort of a lip, probably corresponding with the place where the lacquer stops under the bridge that has lifted. And this wing has gone quite a bit farther, so it does definitely need to be glued back down. The action on this, even with the string tension slacked off a bit, is pretty high. Luckily, there's good saddle height for us to play with. Up here on the top end, we can see a fold line in the headstock overlay, which is usually a portent of doom. And yes, if we flip it over, we can see evidence of a headstock break, which has been glued back together. Seems to have had some color applied on it, which I think is probably touch-up marker. Fairly red looking in comparison to the surroundings, but the glue job seems to be holding just fine. You know, these are not super expensive models, and sometimes, you know, you just want to get it back together and playing. Let's bring it up to pitch, which in this case is actually a half step down from standard tuning. I want to see what the neck does, measure the relief, and get a feel for what's really going on with the bridge. So I'll let it sit for an hour or two. I'm reasonably sure this one isn't in danger of flying off, but, you know, I gotta know what the starting point is in terms of neck relief and action, that kind of stuff. Right, the action at full tension, and I'm measuring the fundamental, the big strings, is just over 8/64 on the bass side, just over 6 on the treble. It's too high. With a capo on the first fret, holding down the string at the body, I'm measuring the fundamental, or the larger string. Looks like we're around 13 thousandths, which is not terrible, but it's not perfect either. I'm going to give the truss rod a tweak and see what happens. With the truss rod tightened, we're now down around 5 thousandths, which I'm much more happy with. That adjustment hasn't changed the action very much. We're still at about 8/64 and 6 on the treble. I'll loosen the strings, but I'm not going to take them off the tuners. I'll keep them on the guitar with a couple of capos, because stringing and restringing a 12-string is, well, it's just no fun. Before I can remove the bridge, I've obviously got to relocate the undersaddle pickup here. Just push that into the body. This is a good time, while the bridge is still in its proper location, to lightly score the lacquer around its outline. Don't cut into the wood. The lacquer on this guitar is characteristic of a bunch of Chinese-made instruments I've seen from the mid-2000s on. I think it's water-based. It's very chippy, and it seems like it's just barely adhered to the wood below. Any dings or chips or cut marks release the bond, and you end up with this bubbling effect. Cutting it is fraught with peril, but in this case it has to be done because you can't glue a bridge to it and expect it to hold. I'm heating the bridge up with my little heating pad, got a knife under it, and it came off pretty easy, even though it was glued on with epoxy, because again, the bond wasn't that great. I'll get through the last couple of little fibers there, and it came away very cleanly because, of course, both surfaces are coated. You can see the white stuff is the epoxy, and there was basically no attempt made to clean off the lacquer from the top. maybe a swipe or two with a chisel, but it's basically gluing to plastic, and we all know how well that works. Did some scraping and then some sanding and got it all down to bare wood. Oh man, that's a lot of epoxy. Some self-adhesive sandpaper cut to fit the outline of the bridge and placed in position, and then I use it as a means to mark the high spots, which I'll scrape off and then do more sanding and more scraping. More clamps are better. I've got the bridge pinned in position with a couple of machine screws around which I put some tape so they're a really snug fit in their holes. And I wax the screws to make sure they don't get stuck. Get this all clamped up, clean out the resultant squeeze out, and let it sit for a day. Just cleaning off the glue residue, which is also cleaning the black off the bridge. I need to ream out any glue residue that's now in the holes, as I want to lower the action by about 1/32 of an inch, or its metric equivalent. I need to remove double that from the saddle, a full 1/16 of an inch, which is just around 1.5 millimeters. It's best to be conservative here and sneak up on the desired height, which is a pain because it means a bunch of restringing, but that's the life we lead. The dark curved line you see there is not mine. It was, I guess it's probably black transferred from the top of the bridge. I'm using a sanding stick here at right angles. In the end, I was very happy with 5/64ths on the bass, 4 on the treble. Again, I have to say this every once in a while, the unit is immaterial, use whatever you like. On a 6-inch rule, the 64th divisions are smaller than the 0.5 millimeter ones you find on a metric ruler. So, you can use a micrometer device or some kind of wedge, whatever you like. The nut is loose in the slot, and it wants to slide around when you put the strings on. Also, the corners are a bit sharp if you run your hand into them. That's the kind of thing I don't like. So I'm going to file those down a bit. I also want to clean off any remnants of previous glue that may be left on the front face of the fingerboard. A touch of medium viscosity super glue will hold things in place. Here you can see more evidence of that delaminating lacquer. Where they cut for the nut slot, it immediately started to come up. I figure in 15 or 20 years, great chunks of this will have left the guitar. There's a little ding on the edge of the fingerboard here around the 4th fret, which is annoying to the thumb if you pass by it. So I'm just going to lightly sand that area and make it softer for your thumb. Polished the frets and oiled the fingerboard. No one's ever figured out, if it's got twice as many strings, why it takes at least 3 times as long to string them. This is why historically it's been very tough for 12-string players to find touring techs for the road. Don't go on that interview, man. I recognize that number. I'm telling you, it's McGuinn, man. Okay. The action on this is now more than 30% lower than when it came in, which is good. It sets up very nicely, pretty easy to play, great big booming sound. Pretty much everything you want out of a 12-string. We have a nice example of a Gibson ES 175 from 1956, I believe. 175 debuted in 1949, had a single P90 to start off with, and this stylish Florentine cutaway, the pointy one. This is the first time Gibson used a Florentine on an electric. Then in 1953 they started making them with dual pickups, so I guess technically this is a 175D. In 1957 it got switched over to humbuckers. In the vintage market that makes for a pretty big bump in price. If this guitar was a year younger it might be worth twice as much. This is a fully hollow, deep-bodied guitar. It's about 3 1/4 inches deep, and it's associated with jazz, obviously. Joe Pass played one, Herb Ellis played one, I think Pat Metheny had one. On the prog rock side of things, Steve Howe of Yes is strongly associated with these as well. This is a laminated guitar. It's not a solid top like an L5, so it's kind of like the working man's professional jazz box. It's one of the most popular jazz guitars in history. Now, this one hasn't been played for a while. It needs a setup. It also smells pretty heavily of basement. It's pretty musty. We talk a lot about keeping acoustic guitars humidified. You don't want them to dry out too much. But the flip side of that is if you store a guitar in an area which is consistently over-humidified, up around 70% like a lot of wet basements are, that can have an effect as well. Glues can break down, especially in electrics like this. Parts start to corrode faster or oxidize, and it's just one of those things. If it ever does dry out, it's got a long way to shrink, right? So things start to fly apart. It's best to find a happy medium if you can. This has some pretty bold black-white purfling on the neck binding, and I don't believe these are the original frets. They seem a bit too big for that. Also, they don't have the nubbins on the end. They've been finished in a nice sort of semi-hemispherical way. The action's on the low side. It's under 4/64ths on the bass, just about 2 on the treble, even less. So yeah, that's really low. Consistent kind of lispy buzz on the treble side of things, so I think probably the bridge has to come up a little bit. And the relief is actually non-existent. So the neck is in a bit of a back bow. Let's see if there's excess tension on the truss rod. We can loosen off a bit, see if anything happens. Yeah, it feels fairly snug. Now we have 4 or 5 thousandths at the 6th fret, and the action has come up a little bit too. We're now sitting at 4/64ths, just over 4 on the bass side, and around 3 on the treble, which is better. It's less clicky. I heard something bumping around, so I decided to investigate and came up with what my friend Grace DeMarin calls a tone ball. This one has been growing for some time, and you wouldn't want to investigate what some of the little white things are because they seem to be like carapaces and stuff. It's a good idea to plug in and see what's going on electronically before we go too far. Dirty. So yeah, there's a pretty big difference in output between neck pickup, which is pretty good, and bridge pickup, which is not so great. Maybe when we clean the pots we'll get a bit more. Yeah, this much fuzz, if it's damp enough, can actually act as a grounding agent. Based on the amount of fuzz and where it's located, I think this was hung on a hanger on a wall for a long time. Seems to be a lot of what might be cat hair and just general dust all over. It's coating the braided wire for the pickups and the capacitors, so you know, it's basically acting as a short, I think, in some measure. Cleaning it off doesn't seem to have had much of an effect. So I'll try to slip the pots down into a place where I can get cleaner into them and do a better job wiping the stuff off, using string tied to them so that I can pull them back up through the holes. Can we talk about how this is the most metal tailpiece ever? It's like 30 years ahead of its time. Should be in a Twisted Sister video. A little spritzy spritz with a little contact cleaner. Man, it's hard to get in there. You're basically bending the straw around a corner. Getting the pots back up and through the hole can be difficult sometimes. Occasionally the string will slip off. That's annoying. It can help to slip a piece of plastic drinking straw over the shaft and then use that to kind of position things in any way that you can do it, basically. But it helps to have something extra to grab hold of. I'm going to have a look at the pickups, so I'll mark which way the bridge base faces and wrap the Viking war hammer so that it doesn't mar the top. The first thing that's very obvious is these are mismatched. One's got gold screws and the other's got nickel. These feel like very short screws in what might be an aftermarket riser. They were only holding on by about one thread. And yes, that is a piece of masonite, and vintage P90s didn't have plastic base plates with exposed magnets. The neck pickup with its gold screws does look much older. That seems to be vintage to me. Some weird things going on with the pickup splicing. Some exposed wire there. That's not usually a good thing. I resoldered the connections and wrapped the wires up better, and then I turned to the frets. Some of these in the lower positions had flat spots and wear and needed some recrowning. These are 1970s style jumbo frets. They're about 104 thousandths wide by about 45 thousandths tall. So pretty chunky in comparison to what was on the original guitar, I imagine. Okay, I'm buttoning this up, putting strings on, and we'll see what happens. This is one of those semi-frequent occasions when something is supposed to be a 1 hour deal, and depending on what happens next, it could turn into several hours of me pulling every single component out to reach a solder joint that's gone cold or something. Maybe cleaning up the attachment points on the pickup has fixed it, or maybe not. If not, I have to send a message to the customer, and it's like 1:45 in the morning currently, so he might not be up. In which case, I'm just going to demo the neck pickup, which is, to be honest, what really makes this jazz guitar jazzy. You know, it's what the jazz cats want. He might decide that that's all he needs. Or maybe we upgrade the bridge pickup too, because if you're going to pull everything out, we might as well check everything off the list, as it's an expensive little adventure getting the harness out of one of these guitars. We'll see. Yeah, it didn't do anything. More noise, less music. So something's shorting out in there. Could be down here at the switch. Could be something in here. Who knows? So at some point I'm going to be taking this all apart.